Let's do it. Just loosen up. We should really have a whole stretch routine before, or like the water thing in my face. I should just have a whole stretch routine in my life that I should just do that occasionally.
You should have one of those warm towels sitting right by your desk when the podcast is about to start, like when you get on an airplane at a
yeah.
Should
we're pretty famous podcasters now. We should just have people bring us these things.
I agree. Diet Coke.
Hello and welcome to Flanagan's Wake, a Doof Media podcast watching, analyzing, and discussing the collective works of Mike Flanagan. My name is Scott Daly, and I am your host. And joining me, as always, having a loud marital spat while you all listen surreptitiously in the other room, it's Matt Freeman. How's it going today, Matt?
I already answered that question, Scott. Why do you always ask me so many questions?
Because that's the point of the show.
I know that's how you show your affection for me. Okay.
Oh, that would have been an answer.
The marital spat is between me and Scott. That's the joke here.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah. Okay.
No, you were telling them. Yeah, they got you. They're listening. This week on the show, we are continuing our time with Stephen King's Gerald's Game as we work up to the Flanagan adaptation of this book. We are reading this week chapters 14 through 24 of King's novel, and it is the morning after the Moonlit Man, and Jessie is finally forced to recall the events of the 1963 eclipse. The truth is harrowing and awful, and Matt, we somehow have to spend the next 2 hours talking all about it in great detail. Maybe this was a mistake.
Yeah, this is definitely, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say like the roughest single unit of reading that we've had to cover in all of our 10 years of talking about books. Just some heinous stuff. Yeah, I think it might be fair for us to say, we were going to say this later on anyway, but I guess I kind of wanted to say up front, like, sure, we're not going to be super explicit in this conversation. We're going to be, but we're also, we're going to, I think, focus mainly on the characters' reactions and the implications of the things that are happening, rather than necessarily specifically talking about the things that are happening.
I think for many reasons, right? I mean, King goes in full detail, and everyone listening to this has presumably read it, so you know it all. And I mean, I don't want to do that because it makes me uncomfortable. Like, this was an incredibly difficult section of text to read. It was just as hard the second time as it was the first time I read it. Just like every time I've watched this film, the scene in question that takes place in the film is in a different way awful. I think seeing it and reading it have very different experiences, but both are still terrible. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any need for us to like go beat by beat for what exactly happens during the eclipse that day, but I do think it is important we talk about what King does with it, why he did it, how he shows it to us, and how that furthers the ongoing story of these characters. That's exactly our job. So that's what we're gonna do.
Well said.
All right. Let's get into it. Before we did that, I did have just a couple of quick things. The first is that there's a slight adjustment to the Flanagan's Wake schedule for Gerald's Game. For some weird reason, I was looking at it as I finished reading this section last week. I was looking at it and I was like, man, the next section is supposed to be only a few chapters, and yet it says it's 80 something pages. And I just made like a weird miscalculation. So there was a whole extra episode in there that there didn't need to be. So originally we were going to cover this in 6 episodes plus an overview. And I added like a whole extra 88 pages to the book that weren't actually in there. So there's only going to be 2 more episodes that won't affect anything that we've read so far. It's just that, the next part will be chapters 25 through 33. and then the part after that will be 34 through the end of the book. So we've got 2 more episodes after this, and then our overview, and then of course the movie. So it's not going to really affect you if you're reading along with us because you haven't gotten there yet. But if you were kind of a read aheader and didn't and looked at the schedule earlier than like 3 days ago, it was a little different. So there's one less episode of Flanagan's Wake now. Sorry everyone.
All right.
Matt, did we want to talk about the Stephen King news? So here, this is so weird because this is going to be so old news for everyone by the time they actually listen to this episode. But the news broke yesterday and then was quickly dismissed by Stephen King himself that he was writing for Mike Flanagan's Dark Tower adaptation. I went back and read the quote, Matt, and it's actually really funny because I think they just completely misinterpreted what King was saying.
I see.
So they asked him if he was going to write for Mike Flanagan's Dark Tower, similar to how he had wrote for The Stand. And what he said was, I don't want to say too much, but I can say it's happening. And I think what he meant by it's happening was just Mike Flanagan's Dark Tower is happening. And I
Right.
can't say too much. And then he went on to say, I am writing, and I don't want to talk too much about what I'm writing. I think he switched gears
Yeah.
in that quote. I think he said, yes, Mike Flanagan's Dark Tower is happening. Also, I'm in the middle of writing something that's Dark Tower adjacent, which is news that we knew about, right? We knew King was writing the third Talisman novel. So I think he just switched topic from one to another, and the anxious for a scoop journalists were pounced all over
Yeah.
it and assumed that he had just confirmed that he's writing for the Dark Tower. It's very funny stuff. By the time y'all are listening to this, old news, but figure you could live vicariously through our frantic day of hearing this news.
Yeah. Well, I think there are probably some number of people who maybe didn't hear part of that. So
Sure, yeah,
clearing it up,
sure.
I think, is valuable.
Yeah. I think the other reason I wanted to bring this up is just because like I see a lot of inaccurate information out there. I want to be clear here. I'm like not an expert of the development process in Hollywood. I've not made a Hollywood movie, Matt, contrary to popular belief.
Huh.
But I do like follow that world pretty closely. I read a lot. I listen to a lot of podcasts about development and things like that. And I see a lot of people like every time the news breaks that Mike Flanagan is working on something that isn't the Dark Tower, I see people like throwing up their hands and being like, "What are you doing? Why? Why aren't you spending every waking minute committed to the Dark Tower and doing that?" And like, I want to bring that up here just because I just want to like everyone chill. That's not how development in this world works. There is there is rarely a case where the thing is not being done yet because a person doesn't feel like working on it. There are many steps. There's a lot of hurry up and wait. There is waiting to try to find someone to do something. There's just a whole lot of weird things in this process. And that's why filmmakers like Flanagan take on so many different projects at the same time, because often you'll take on a project, work on it a little bit, reach a wall in the process, and then just be like, okay, well, I have to wait for some producer to approve something or some studio to say something or a manager to pitch something to someone, and then you can carry on with your work. So yes, Mike Flanagan has a lot on his plate right now, and that's I think because he enjoys that plate and the things that he produces on that plate. But I don't think that necessarily does or does not mean anything about how the Dark Tower adaptation is going. I think it's fair
Right.
to say.
It's basically neutral.
Yeah, yeah. It's going to be a long process. The show still doesn't have a home, so he could write every single script, but he would not necessarily have anyone to finance the movie, the show to make the script. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. We will talk about any of it as it breaks. I think the dream is for us as we are finishing up everything that is planned on the schedule so far, that by the time we get to the end of that, maybe we'll have some Dark Tower stuff to watch and talk about. But we'll see. I'm still excited for everything else that's happening. There's an
Yeah.
Exorcist movie. There's a Carrie television show. There's a Clayface movie that Flanagan wrote that's directed by someone else, but I think we're going to cover that too when it comes out next year. There's a lot of stuff. It's very fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the idea that there would be a Dark Tower TV show done by Mike Flanagan was a Hail Mary. That it would be awesome if it happened. but we got plenty to talk about without that so far.
Absolutely. Yep. All right. So, with that set aside, let's get right into it this week. We begin with chapter 14, a very, very short 2-page chapter that kicks us off as Jessie wakes up in the middle of the night to find the Moonlight Man gone. The only real thing to point out here, Matt, is that her brain kind of almost immediately goes into rationalization mode as she briefly wakes up, finds him gone, and then is just like, okay, this this never happened. He was never here. It was just a dream the whole time, which goes contrary, I think, to everything she felt at the end of last week's reading.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think this is simultaneously a pretty realistic reaction to having experienced something so horrific.
Yeah,
Uh, but it's also at the same time very indicative of Jesse's character specifically
yeah,
as someone who habitually avoids thinking about horrifying truths.
yeah,
Um, and I want to step back from that statement I just said and say, you know, I think, especially when I go back and listen to like what I said last week, I think there's a risk that when I say things like that, it comes off as judgmental. Like I'm judging Jessie for being the way she is. And I kind of
sure,
wanted to clarify and expand a bit on like what I'm trying to say there is like she avoids thinking about horrifying truths because she grew up having to live with a horrifying truth
yeah,
that was so painful that avoiding thinking about it really was like a rational and reasonable response. Um, so there's no judgment there. It's not like I'm sitting here rolling my eyes at this character and being like, stupid, just be honest. It's like, no, I like we all kind of do this in our own way about any number of things in our lives of various magnitudes of seriousness. It's a totally human and natural response. We're merely pointing out this is the structure of this character. This is how this character is crafted.
yeah,
Is someone who is compartmentalized, who is sort of split in half along the fault line of this horrific thing that happened to her that she can never quite look at. And the heart of this book is lies in the idea that she has to face those horrifying truths to survive. She has to face the truth of what happened in her past to survive. She has to face the truth of the nightmare Moonlight Man who entered the room. It is actually real.
yeah.
This is a through line that cuts through the whole book. So it's super important. And I just want to contextualize that so that when I inevitably say something again that maybe as it comes out of my mouth sounds insensitive, it's like I'm trying to just do a good analysis here, and I get that it's going to sound a certain way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, like this is the thing, you know, this is the thing about fiction, right? As compared to real life, like the things that happen to characters in books happen for a purpose. There's a reason behind it, and that like this is all exploring these things for some sort of thematic and plot related reason. So yeah, I think when we say something like this character needs to get over it, she needs to get over her trauma, which is I think something we talked about in several of the movies we've talked about over the course of the show so far, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that's coming from a place of like, come on, man, just get
Yeah.
over it. I
Right.
think it's just coming from a place of like, that is what the plot has constructed for us. That part of the advancement of this character through their plot is finding a way to get through or deal or process their trauma in a way that they haven't been before. Um, and I think that is you're absolutely right. That is true of Jesse. Like I don't think any of us would ever say, "Come on, Jesse, like you really got to let this shit go, man. Come on, no, no. What she went through was awful." And also like to the idea of what you're saying here that she habitually avoids thinking about things like not only was that just a survival mechanism that Jesse adopted, it was also a survival mechanism that we'll see this week was kind of pushed on her by the man who's responsible for it, right? Like not only did she learn to survive this way, but he forced her to think of it this particular thing this way. He forced her to not think about it, to push it out of her mind, to um break relationships with people rather than tell them the truth of it. Like this all came from him. So yeah, ultimately
Exactly.
this is something that you're absolutely right. Like the point of the book is she needs to face this stuff to get to it, and I do love that kind of dovetailing with the concept of this Moonlight Man. And yeah, I mean, like it is pretty ironic that when we were in it last week, I think the conclusion we came to is this is absolutely real. Of course it is. The text is being rather explicit that it's real. Jessie has a feeling of realism. And then we start this week with no, it's not real. It's not real. It's not real. And it isn't until the very end of this week's reading, the last chapter that we're talking about this week, where she sees the earring, she sees the footprint, and it's like, oh no, now we have physical evidence actually that this whole thing was real. And I don't think it's an accident that that happens after this week's moments of her coming and facing the events that happened to her and allowing herself to say yes they happened, yes they were real, and yes what my father did was despicable.
Yeah. I totally agree. I mean, I think there's a very clear parallel between the, literal physical monster in the room and the monster that is her father, and the connection is drawn for us. In last week's reading, she thought it was her father,
Yeah,
and so yes, it's these ideas are being connected, and like you just said, the idea that her facing the pain of it and suffering through the pain of it, reliving the pain of it, allows her to have a realization. And the realization, there's the dual realization. You basically just said this, but the realization of like, wait a minute, my dad did a real mind job on me,
yeah.
and he did it on purpose. And then oh my god, there was actually a guy here in the room
Yeah,
with me. Um, so
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, definitely. All right, Matt, here we go. Chapter 15. Just like that, 2 pages in, we're already back in 1963. By the way, I read this week's reading while I was at my office at work, and I read those first 2 pages, and I was kind of jetting along. And then this, and I was like, oh, I forgot we're doing this week. I have to
Uh-huh.
read this at work. No, I'm not gonna do that. I can't do that. The disconnect would be too much for me. But yeah, here
Yeah.
we are right at the beginning, back in 1963, the summer of the eclipse at Dark Score Lake. And this is like we've already said this, but this is going to be very difficult to work through here.
Difficult to work through for us, and I guess it's worth saying a choice by Stephen King to do it this way. Obviously, it almost seems absurd to say that, right? But sometimes you have to say obvious things. He could have just written this in a very circuitous style. He could have flinched away from actually showing the moment of it, of the assault, and just shown what led up to it and the aftermath to it. I think that's what 99% of writers who take this idea and this concept would have done.
Yeah,
But it's important to the functioning of this book specifically and the themes of this book that we not flinch away from it, and that Jessie not flinch away from it.
yeah,
That's why it matters. It's because Jessie, the character whose mind we're inhabiting, needs to understand what actually happened and face the pain of it, which
yeah,
means so do we. You can't skip over that. It totally guts the story if you skip over it, right? Um,
yeah. I,
so
I
yeah.
I completely agree. I mean, this is the kind of I guess you could call it the trap he's gotten himself in, where like you set up a concept like this, you define it thematically the way it's defined here. You can't not do this. You can't, and I don't think Stephen King ever would. He's not. I don't think he's ever been the type of writer that would flinch away from any of this stuff. Like he is always, always, always freely jumped into the worst possible thing that human beings are capable of. And he's never flinched away from it. He's never, like, he talks in on writing so much about honesty, right? And then we've talked about this throughout Kingslingers, that honesty in his writing seems to be the most important thing to him. And I think it would just feel dishonest to construct this terrible thing that happened and not be like, we can't we can't really understand how horrible this was until we see it in we shine the light completely on it. We don't leave anything in the shadow. We don't leave anything hidden. We don't leave anything unsaid, anything unexperienced. We need to fully see it to understand it. And look, I think there's people out there that would vehemently disagree with that idea, right? Like, I mean, there's probably people listening right now that maybe have never finished this book because they got to the scene and just said, I don't want to read this. I don't want to go through this. And I don't fault those people anything, right? I do not. It was not an easy experience for me, certainly. But I do have a level of respect for King for always like there's nothing that's too far for him. He will explore it. And he never obviously paints it as anything other than a monstrous, horrible thing. Um,
Yeah.
so
Right. I just think it's interesting. There's often a discussion around art about like, people making accusations that such and such work of art is gratuitous or and I feel like King we've read a lot of King books at this point. I think he's never gratuitous. I think if he's going to show something horrible, it's it's important and necessary to the story he's telling. And sometimes you kind of relish in the horror of it if it's a certain kind of horror. Certainly not in this
sure,
particular case, but sometimes there's a naughty joy to something horrible. But I really don't think he ever does it just for the sake of it. I think it's always put to a purpose, and this is
yeah,
no exception.
yeah, I agree. All right. So the chapter opens by explaining exactly how Jessie ended up alone with her father on the day of the eclipse. She tells a story about how she was scared of some weird old lady neighbor who had like smacked her hand when she took a cookie one day, which by the way, I think by design a very juvenile fear to have, right? Like there's a lot of things early in this chapter that are really leaning into making sure we fully understand that Jessie is a child. She still thinks like a child. She still acts like a child. She is a child. She's 10 years old. She's a kid still. I think
Yeah.
this is really important for what King does.
Yeah, there's a lot of my kids basically range from below 10 to above 10, and you very often see you come to think of them as being more mature than in some sense they are, and then you see flashes of they're still very much a child in many ways,
Yeah,
and that made it all a lot more, I think, impactful to me that I have a frame of reference of just knowing exactly what 10-year-olds are like.
sure.
Um, and uh, uh, understanding. I mean, I think understanding the inner life of a 10-year-old too, like by knowing my kids really well, basically. And this is a bit of a tangent, but I've always found that like whatever age your kid is at, you suddenly find yourself remembering all kinds of things from when you were that age. It's like a little memory amplifier for like whatever
Huh.
age that is. Like, oh yeah, that was when I was in this house and I was doing this and I was going to that school. These were my friends, and that's when all these memories come back. And it's partly because like their their experience of the world is reminding you of how you were experiencing the world at that time. So anyway, I'm because my kids are this age, I'm already kind of keyed in to to understanding it. I feel personally.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just another comment on this section, like a lot of what we're doing here is building up all these little elements because so we know what's going to happen. We know where this is going. The book has been pretty clear with us about where this is going. Uh, and so but we're kind of in the perspective of little Jessie, and little Jessie is not big Jessie. These are sort of two different characters,
Yeah.
and so everything we're seeing all these moments that little Jessie is perceiving, and we're seeing all these thoughts little Jessie is having. We're seeing like the fact that it was her who wanted to spend time alone with her dad and took steps to manipulate her parents to make that happen. And from our perspective, we're understanding, oh my God, this is going to make her think that what happened is her fault. That's just one of many examples of things where sort of these seeds are being planted, and we understand the significance of them because we know what's going to happen. But little Jessie obviously doesn't. So there's this horrible dramatic irony
Yeah.
that's building throughout this whole section.
Yeah, and let's be clear here, right? Like, fuck that, right?
Yeah.
She specifically says in this moment, much later, Jessie would think that this was yet another reason to keep her mouth shut about what had happened that day. There might be those, her mother, for instance, who would say that she had no right to complain, that she had in fact gotten about what she deserved, and yeah, like, we're absolutely right. The thing is kind of brilliantly constructed so that Jessie feels like she wanted this, she asked for it, she manipulated people, she had her dad go to her mom, and the truth under all of that is her father, that who has been playing this the entire time, right? He's manipulating things to go his way. He's the one that suggests she wear the sundress. He talks to his wife. I don't know if the text ever fully explicitly says that, but the writing under the all of this is that he knows as he argues with his wife that Jessie is listening in. He
Mhm.
knows about this weird acoustic feature of their house that if you sit in a certain place, you can hear the conversation going on in that particular room perfectly. He knows this, and so this is all part of this plan. And I guess it's I want to be careful about how to say this because I legitimately believe, and you'll tell me if you think I'm wrong here, that I don't think Tom went into this day thinking I'm gonna sexually assault my daughter on this day. I don't think that was like a conscious thought in his head as he's planning and moving in this thing. I think he just is kind of driven by some kind of base, monstrous, awful shit. And I don't know. Like, do you feel like I'm not saying it's kind of tough because I'm not saying it's not premeditated because obviously like wear the sundress, like he like setting everything up this way. He's the one that says you want to sit on my lap, you know. Um but I don't know, like do you think in this moment he's thinking like this is what I'm going to do?
That's a really interesting question because until you asked that question, I actually was thinking that this was very calculated on his part. Um,
Parts of it are. I think that's the complicated part.
yeah, but like, does he have that end point firmly in
Yeah.
his mind and
Mhm.
explicitly in his mind? Again, I was thinking that that he was explicitly arranging the situation toward that end point. Now, I so short answer is no, I that wasn't my perception. But as soon as you said that, where my head went to was actually the direct connection with Gerald and how like I actually don't think Gerald was like, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna get my wife. I'm gonna coldly get my wife used to the idea of being handcuffed for sexual play, and then I'm going to create a situation where we're isolated, and then I handcuff her to the bed, and then I sexually assault her. I
Mhm.
don't think Gerald was. I don't think that was Gerald's plan. I think
Yeah.
that the proximity to risque and violent and sort of inappropriate sexual acts was what was exciting to Gerald about the
Yeah.
handcuffs.
Sure.
So it's like the Gerald's game is like, how close to this line can we get?
Yeah.
That that's not that he wants to cross the line, but it's the line that's exciting. So
And I think that's absolutely true with Tom as well. Like that there is a part of this that even the lying to his wife about it and to manipulating the situation about it is part of what's exciting about it. And I do think he skirts right up to that line and then he blows through it. Um because
yeah,
he loses control. Because I guess ultimately like this doesn't I guess matter from like a because it's not like we're trying to say oh it wasn't as bad because you didn't plan it. Like that's not what I'm trying to argue at all, right? I think it's just interesting to kind of frame who this person is and what his actions were because I do think there is the moment at the very end of all where we see where Jesse reads on him some level of guilt about what he did, and I do think that is a legitimate emotional reaction he has to it. Like, I think he fucked up in a billion different ways and he did terrible things. And then had maybe one moment of clarity afterwards that he was like, "Oh, what the fuck did I do?" And then of
mhm,
course he doubles down on it and does something arguably even worse by fucking with her head as well. But I do think that exists there, and so yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think the same thing with the handcuffs, the idea of having her here and then just walking up to that line is exciting to him.
mhm. Yeah. I still feel like we could learn some information later that makes me kind of nudge more in one direction or the other in terms of how premeditated this was.
Sure.
But I do find that interesting.
Yeah. I mean,
Uh,
ultimately, what was premeditated is that he wanted this situation. He wanted to be alone with his daughter. He wanted her wearing a dress that was too short, too tight. He wanted this. Now, whether he wanted that specific act at the end of it all, almost irrelevant because he wanted every single bit of this.
yeah, and he definitely has the urges that
Yeah.
lead to what happens, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not an accident. Um,
Yep.
I think it's interesting to think about Tom Mayhoot,
Is that how you
because
pronounce it? I've been avoiding saying the name because I didn't know how to pronounce it.
I think that's how the audiobook reader says it.
Okay.
So, we've read a billion Stephen King novels, plus or minus, and like you feel like you get a sense of how Stephen King does villains after a while. And I think the fascinating thing about Tom Mayhoot is like it actually felt like a little bit of a stretch for me to even call him a villain.
Mm.
Which, like, you say that out loud, and you're like, of course, he's a villain. He's a monster. He's one of Stephen King's greatest monsters. Really,
Yeah.
actually, um, he's also one of Stephen King's most realistic, mundane monsters.
Yeah.
Perhaps literally. I mean, like, there's no supernatural tinge to this guy at all. Um, and I just think that's interesting that that's even maybe why I wanted to say. Part of why I wanted to say that it's premeditated is it actually makes him more of a monster to say it's a premeditated sexual assault.
Sure.
Um, it makes him it makes him feel too close to just like, oh, he's just a fallible human, to say that it was, he didn't he he didn't want it to happen, but he wanted it to happen.
Mhm.
It's a very uncomfortable gray area to say, like, that's just a man. That's just a man. There's nothing magical. There's nothing particularly evil.
Yeah.
Um, it's it feels gross to even say that.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, you are completely. Like, yeah, I mean, this is we want these people to be evil. We want these people to be monsters because then we don't have to deal with the fact that just human beings are capable of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Like the idea that he was planning this all from the beginning helps support the idea that no, there's something there's something unhuman about him. Um, but I think he's just a fundamentally broken person who
Hmm.
uh, does terrible things and then doubles down on them because he's a fucking asshole. I hate him
Yep.
so much.
Yep.
Don't know on my list of characters from books that I hate. Pretty far up there.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
um, I really like this detail though that Tom, when Jessie approaches him about her plan for them to be alone on the eclipse day, he's reading Profiles in Courage, which is the Pulitzer Prize winning biography written by then Senator John F. Kennedy about 8 courageous U.S. senators. It was an incredibly popular book at the time. I think it came out in the mid '60s, but just very very popular. Or it's mid '50s, sorry. Very very popular book. It makes total sense that a person that in 1963 would be reading it, but that's a hilarious choice, Stephen King, to give this completely uncourageous, awful, monstrous human being reading book about these courageous senators that bucked the trends of their party to risk it all for their sense of morality and justice.
That's yeah. It's funny. I'm going to kind of repeat the point that I just said, which is like, part of me wants to say that he's reading this book because he's a reptile in a skin suit, and he's reading Profiles in Courage to try to understand how admirable humans behave, so that he can copy their surface features and pass as one of them. But again, I don't actually think that's true. I think it diminishes what King is doing with his character to say, oh, he's just a cynical monster in every way. It's like, no, we don't get to excuse him of his humanity.
Mhm.
Uh, I think he is also a compartmentalized person, like Jesse becomes. And there's a part of him that admires these people and wants to be admirable, and then there's this other part over here, and
Yeah.
we're compartmentalized.
Yeah, I agree. Also, just a fun fact about this is that John F. Kennedy didn't write this book. It was written by a speechwriter, Ted Sorensen. I think it came out in it was decades later. I think
Oh,
Sorensen wrote an autobiography in the 2000s that was yeah, that was pretty much me.
uh-huh.
I think
Makes
so. Here
sense.
it is. He did a first draft of most of the chapters and quote helped choose the words of many of its sentences. Oh, so you wrote it?
Uh-huh. That's
um,
funny.
I don't know. Obviously, that I don't think that was known information at the time of King writing this story. So that's not I don't think the fact that he's reading a story about courage that was written by a man who didn't actually write it plays into any of his choice to pick this particular book, but it is kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is. I feel like we've got this, and then we've got the dog formerly known as Prince. This is a weirdly prophetic book.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of the conversation between Tom and Sally, man, Matt, there is a lot here. King is, I think, being very, very careful with the words that he's choosing here. We talked last week. I think I asked you the question generally: do you think Sally suspects anything, any of her husband's feeling towards his daughter? And I'm not saying she does or doesn't, but the word choiceage that King uses as they're having this conversation, I think is really interesting. She's talking about Jessie a lot, and the line here is, "That was no sacrifice for our Jessie," Sally replied. She sounded almost grim, grim when talking about her daughter. And the interesting thing about this is Jessie's kind of internalization of a lot of what her mother says about her in this conversation is, "Oh, she doesn't like me. I bother her. She hates me." And what I'm posing here is perhaps there was some level of knowledge or awareness that Sally had about what was going on here, and it complicates her feelings, and things that come off in some ways are not necessarily meant for her feelings towards Jessie.
I agree. Pretty uncomplicatedly agree in this case, actually.
Mhm.
I think I'm going to use the word of the day again. I think that Sally is also compartmentalized.
Yeah.
I think she has this horrible, unspeakable suspicion that her husband is a predator. Um, which if she knew that, then she must act on it if it were true,
Mhm.
and thus she wants to avoid ever having to find out if it's true. Like there's a relatable impulse here. Like I think we've all been in the position of like not wanting to know something
Sure.
because you're just like, that would hurt a lot if that were true. So I'm gonna not pursue that line of thought any further.
Yeah.
Like to think that I've grown out of it, but definitely used to be a feature of my psyche. And I think it's what's happening here is like, just as Tom says, oh, it would blow the family apart. Like there's some part of her that's like, I can't accept the possibility that this is true because it would blow up my whole life.
Yeah, I mean,
So
the idea of something like this is so beyond the pale that
yeah,
you would have a certain amount of disgust and guilt for even briefly thinking it could be the case. Because how could you think about a person? I think there is a lot of this is a man I married because I love him and I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him, and I have this sneaking suspicion he's doing something to my daughter, or he has some level of feelings toward my daughter. But even having that thought is filled with guilt because that's my husband.
yeah,
It's so fucking awful and complicated. Totally relatable feelings. You could completely understand why she would have that thought and do exactly what she's doing here, right?
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
There's also more mundane, uh, you know, low level like explanation here that I was thinking about, and this is probably not even something that would have occurred to me ever until I was a parent. But like, let's just like hypothetically say that you have a child who has been lying a lot, and you and your spouse are talking about this fact. You might say some things that if the child heard them would sound extremely harsh and judgmental,
Yeah.
and like would be very painful for the child to hear about. But like, you as the parent in that moment, you are not feeling any ill will toward the child as you're saying these things. You're not like, you're the undercurrent of you saying is not like, oh, my child sucks, I
Yeah.
hate them, and they're a liar. It's like, we need to solve this lying problem because it's going to like be really hard to deal with later in life, and it's we need to just nip this in the bud because it's out of love, right? It's out of love that you say these critical things, which
Yeah.
again, if the child heard them, they'd be very hurt. So like, I think there's a like I said, a mundane level on which Sally is like correctly diagnosing that her daughter is kind of manipulative, and is like, that's that's not good. It's not good to
Yeah.
be that way. It's not good to think that you can get away with that behavior.
Yeah.
And Jesse is like internalizing it, you know?
Sure. Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and this all the more reason why, if Tom fully knows that her daughter is listening in on this conversation, they should get the hell out of that room and have this conversation somewhere else. Because
Right.
yeah, you're having a conversation about and I think it is just true in this family, at least from the mother's perspective, that she was the more difficult of the like. The people that have kids know that there are kids that are sometimes easier and there are kids that are sometimes more difficult, right? That is just the case. I love both my children. One of them is definitely more difficult than the other. I'm not going to say which one in case they one day, many years from now, listen to this, but they know. Um, but I mean, that is just true. And yeah, like, I mean, we are going through some stuff right now, and my wife and I were whining to each other about things that were happening, and it's like it's not meant hurtful, and you never say it in front of the children. But there's like some frustration that happens, and it's much better to take out your frustration in a conversation with your spouse or partner than it is with the child themselves, right? So yeah, again, Tom, you should have known better than to have this conversation in a place where she could hear, because but that is all part of the manipulation, right? That what Tom is doing, like there's this line here that she says, her father stuck up for her, her mother stuck it to her. That is not an accident that that's happening.
Mhm.
He's fostering this kind of relationship. He's fostering a relationship with his daughter where he is seen as the hero that's going to swoop in. No one understands her like he does, and mother is the one that's causing all your problems. Like he's doing that, actively doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, he's currying her favor, and he's stoking a schism between her and her mom so that
Yeah.
she will trust him more. Again,
It's
kind of
predatory
open.
shit. Yeah.
It is like, that's the thing. Like, leaving open the question of whether this whole weekend is premeditated. It's like really low manipulative predatory behavior.
Yeah.
It's um it's deeply manipulative and abusive, actually.
Mhm.
Even setting aside the sexual assault aspect of this.
Yep.
Yeah.
I really love this line too. I should have known it came down to Dick Sleafort. Her mother sounded angrily amused, a combination that made Jessie's head spin. It seemed to her that only adults could combine emotions in so many daffy ways. If feelings were food, adult feelings would be things like chocolate covered steak, mashed potatoes with pineapple bits, Special K with chili powder sprinkles on it instead of sugar. Jessie thought that being an adult seemed more like a punishment than a reward. This is one of those moments where we'll see this come back later, right? Like she looks at the idea of holding two emotions and two feelings in you at the same time as strangely and upsettingly adult, and she doesn't get it. And then we'll return to this idea later as she's going through the things that just happened to her and feeling this way, and
Mhm.
like kind of being pushed into a place where now she has to reason with things in an adult manner, despite the fact that she is indeed still 10 years old.
Yeah. Yeah, I think more of these themes of duality and contradictions
Yeah.
are arising.
Yep. Yep. And then, of course, the coup de grace of this whole thing is, I swear to God, sometimes you behave as if she were your girlfriend instead of your daughter, which is, uh, again, I think it's really interesting to think about her mother and kind of pushed into this place where perhaps just a little bit of her fear and suspicion leaks out, where she wouldn't have said that except out of anger, um, because that would reveal something too much. And it is actually that moment, which is a true statement that she just said, as we'll see, that wins the argument for Tom, because now he gets to play the hurt victim of like, how could you? That's really nasty to say. How could you possibly say that about me? And that's how he wins.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's like the text keeps reinforcing to us that he's like this lawyer who's really good at verbal manipulations.
Yeah.
And I think it's totally plausible that he's, winding her up. He's intentionally provoking her and making her feel like, she's a bad mom and that she's a bad wife, and agitating her. And to the degree that she has this suspicion, he's kind of almost goading her into saying something so that he can then make her feel really bad about it. Like
Yeah.
this is pure headcanon, what I'm about to say here, but like I think I think that she did, you know, have this suspicion, but she doesn't want to believe it. And so her blurting out, um, I swear to God, sometimes you behave as if she were your girlfriend. I think this is like a a feeling that is deep inside her
Yeah.
that she didn't want to let out. She's been
Mhm.
cramming it down,
Yeah.
and he has needled her to the point where she says it. And interestingly, she doesn't ask a question. There's no question mark at the end of that sentence.
Yeah.
It's a I don't know if you've ever heard the meme. I'm just joking, which is it's basically used to mean like you say something you absolutely 100% meant, but like
Yeah.
you oh no, I was just joking. I was just joking. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
it's that that's what it is. I swear to God, sometimes you behave as if she were your girlfriend instead of your daughter. It's like, what? Why say that if you don't mean it, literally?
Yeah.
So, but because it's said in a way that allows it to be said, and then allows him to shoot it down and make her feel bad about it, and now the issue is closed.
Yeah.
It's very deft manipulation.
It
Really,
is. It is.
really
And
good
and I
stuff.
I love what is said here, right? Like, "I apologize," Sally said, and although she still sounded angry, Jessie thought she now sounded a little afraid as well. "Keep her tomorrow if that's what you want. Fine, good. You're welcome to her." Like, the again, the word choice it's here, very charged, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and I think you're right. I think this is all part of her being pushed and prodded into, and I guess, like, we don't we say that her reaction to this is very relatable, and I understand the truth of that. I don't wanna, like, fully divorce her from any of the responsibility as a parent in this
yeah,
situation, right? Like, I don't think we're doing that, right? Like, you have a responsibility to protect your children, even if it means sometimes protecting them from their other parent, right?
yes.
And so she has that responsibility, and she did fail, but she was manipulated very cleverly by this terrible man.
Yeah. I mean, I think he knows her vulnerabilities. I agree. I mean, you never want to absolve anybody. I do think the way this scene has been structured, she is just outplayed here.
Yeah. Mhm.
So,
So the chapter ends with Jessie happily peppering her daddy with kisses for successfully convincing her mom to let him stay, and him, of course, accidentally touching her breasts. Awesome. Great. Love it.
yeah, King does kind of. I think what he's kind of doing here is he's showing us that we're not going to get any reprieve. Like we're going to
Yeah.
actually do this. Um, And I think on the level, so okay, so another thing that this is accomplishing, I think, is there's a lot happening in these chapters where Jessie, little Jessie, is never really thinking accurately about what her father is thinking at the
Mhm.
time,
Yeah.
but we are, because we're
Yep.
adults and we're modeling him as a vicious predator.
Yep.
And so that moment to me reads as, oh, he's testing. He's seeing, how's she going to react when I do this?
Mhm.
If she reacts a certain way, I probably need to back off. If she reacts a different way, I'll see how much. Yeah, I'll do another test later. We'll see. We'll see how far we can go with this. Right.
Yeah.
That's and of course none of these thoughts occur to Jessie actually.
Of course not. Yeah. Like, I don't think she fully sees and understands her father and everything he's doing until 29 years later, laying in a bed in
Right.
a lake house. Yeah.
Right. Right.
All right, here we go. Chapter 16. As we said, we're not going to go into any super details about the event itself, but the chapter begins with Jessie putting on the much too small sundress. She puts on her sister's perfume, her mother's deodorant, and more of her lipstick. She puts her hair up in a way that she knows her daddy likes. And I think we just want to say here, like, this is probably in Tom's warped, terrible mind, her asking or wanting what happens to happen, right? Like, but this is a child who is trying to impress their daddy, who they love, and
Yeah.
make their dad happy. Like, that's just what this is,
Right.
and it's not anything else.
Yeah. It's closer to just dress up and
Yeah,
childish conception of looking pretty with no object to that. It's just looking pretty.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But she's already starting to suspect a little bit, right? Like, there's this moment where she thinks about the moment the night before where her father touched her inappropriately and shivers. And we see here, even before the sexual assault happens, Jessie is already beginning to deploy these survival mechanisms that are so familiar to her, right? She says here, there's no sense shivering over stupid stuff you couldn't understand or even thinking about it. It's like she's already trying to tell herself, don't think about it. Just don't think about it. I'll be fine.
Yeah. Which is also a relatable response.
Yep. Yeah.
Um, yeah. Just more beats of stuff that child Jessie doesn't understand, but we understand. We understand the implications of it, and we understand how she's going to hold it against herself later that she, in her own mind, played into this, even though it is she who is being manipulated.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, that's what's so painful about it, and that's why we have to walk through it. I think that's critically.
Yeah.
It's almost like a manual for understanding how a person talks themselves into the position that, oh, it was all my fault, when it's clearly wasn't. But it only clearly wasn't if you happen to be an adult reading the account. And if you were actually the child in this position, it wouldn't be clear at all.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And I think that's true about this next part as well, because Jessie finds her dad outside in nothing but gym shorts and a bandana, making eclipse viewfinders out of panes of glass, and she has this weird moment where she feels this kind of weird combination and mixes of emotions. Right? She goes back to that metaphor we were talking about of an adult holding two emotions, seemingly opposing emotions at the same time. Ice cream and gravy, she calls it. And I want to be clear again, like, she's a child that's going through puberty. Everything in her brain and her body is a fucking mess right now and is not capable of being understood by a child. Like, this is not on, none of this is on her, right?
Mhm.
And yet again, her dad is putting her in a situation where he dresses like this intentionally. Of course he does. Of course he does. He looks at her like this intentionally. Of course he does. And she does not have the capability of fully understanding what anything is here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the most just purely sad moments is where and I guess this is actually later, so this is a bit out of order, but it's fine that she's thinking about like what she has picked up about like knowledge of sexuality,
Yeah.
which,
Mhm.
when I was a kid, I learned everything I knew about sex from overheard conversations on the school bus, and I had some really interesting notions
Yeah.
about sex. I don't remember them very clearly anymore, but I do remember well enough to know that there were some significant inaccuracies,
Mhm.
and which is all charming to think about as an adult, but like the horror of it in this situation is suddenly to a child for whom the concept of sexuality is this vague amorphous thing that they don't know about, don't want to know about, don't care about, don't want to care about. Suddenly the reality of it is thrust upon them.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's just a horrifying uh, breach of innocence, and um, it just sucks.
It's awful. It's the worst. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, this is such good writing. Like, this is what I like, the way that King understands all of this, how awful it is, how disgusting it is, how the correct things to emphasize when. I think you're absolutely right. The idea of her confusingly not understanding what sex even is, or how one gets pregnant, or what sperm even is, like, all of this stuff is so cleverly included here to reinforce the idea that she's a kid. She's a kid. She doesn't understand any of this stuff. She's just starting to understand it, and she just understands it on just enough level to know it was wrong and disgusting, and he did something to me he shouldn't have done. But, like, God, it's so fucking awful.
Hmm.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Okay. By the way he calls her Punkin, just it makes me fucking sick. It makes me sick. I hate
Yeah.
it.
King knows what he's doing there.
Yep. Yep. All right, so then things begin to happen. We briefly cut to chapter 17 here, where we jump back to present day Jessie, sleeping, who becomes kind of consciously aware that she's sleeping and says, "I'm not really dreaming, though. I'm not dreaming about the day of the eclipse. This isn't a dream. This is just me reliving it." And I think the reason this cut matters, the reason we do this, the reason King breaks this, is not just to give us a momentary pause of relief before we get into the worst parts of this, although that is definitely part of it. But we have Jessie in this moment recognize she's reliving this event, recognize she's about to go through this again, and choosing consciously not to run away from the memory, indeed to run towards it. I think the quote is, "Some part of her that intended to have this out in the open once and for all, no matter what the cost." So, like, fine, like, this is like, Jessie is consciously, subconsciously, whatever you want to call it. She's technically asleep, so I guess we can't necessarily say consciously, but she is choosing, she is making the choice to this time not run away from it, to this time not push it out of her mind, to this time not escape to a place that doesn't have this thing that happened to me in it. She's choosing, okay, let's fucking do it. Let's just do it. Finally, at last.
Yeah. And she hasn't consciously made the connection yet, but I think what we are beginning to understand is that this is going to be necessary for her survival.
Yep.
Because we've encountered this idea before. We haven't talked about this in a while, that there's a part of her that believes that she deserves to be handcuffed to this bed,
Hmm.
and deserves to die. Really, is worthless and deserves to die.
Yeah.
And that's what she has to defeat to survive.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Matt, chapter 18. Obviously, we're going to skip ahead a little bit here, but let's just say here, this is incredibly awful. There are very few moments in my life where I've felt like physically ill reading something, and this book gets to be a proud member of that list. Like I said, even reading this again, I've read this book before. I knew this was going to happen. I've watched the movie a couple times. I knew this was going to happen. That same feeling returned. That feeling of absolute disgust, terror, and blistering hate for this character. Oh my god, I hate this character so much. Um, I hate when people say, like, as a father, because it implies, I think, accidentally, that a person who isn't a parent wouldn't have a visceral, disgusted reaction to these events, when obviously that's not true. Like, anyone, whether they're a parent or not, would hopefully be as disgusted by these events as I was. But it is the first time I've read this book since I became a dad. And by the way, the last time I will read this book. This is it.
Yeah.
I'm going to be done with this book forever, I think, at this point. And imagining this happen to, like, I have my little girl, she's not 10, she's barely, not even 2, but, like, just imagining this thing happen to her, like, it makes me want to throw up. Like, it does.
Right.
And god, it's awful.
I think honestly, that's what as a father really means, is like, it's extra special revolting because our minds automatically imagine these things happening to our child instead of just some child,
Yeah.
and that fills you with a vivid and specific rage rather than kind of a generic and like probably quite powerful but non-specific rage.
Yeah, there's a show I'm watching right now called The Pit. It's about an ER in Pittsburgh, and there was a thing on it in last week's episode. I won't spoil too much, but a very very sad thing happened to a very young little girl, and I was losing my absolute shit. And that
Mhm.
thing always would have made me sad. But yeah, like it is kind of remarkable how deftly the brain is able to go. That's yours. That's yours right there. Just
Yeah,
just think about what that would be like to go through that with your kid.
right. Exactly.
It's really good at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
um so all that being said, Matt, I think we kind of already talked about this a little bit, but let's hit this drum here again. Let's talk about King's choice here. Like he doesn't hold back. We're glossing over these details for the sake of ourselves and our listeners, but King does not. We get to relive this event beat by horrible beat, like minute by minute, second by second. We get to see Jessie go from confused to scared to terrified to guilty. Is there any other reason we do this on top of what you already said about like this is Jessie? The point of the book is for Jessie to relive this. So how could the book then turn us away from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would feel almost like cheapening the reality of this event and the fact that people go through things like this,
Hmm.
to act like it's something. Oh, we can't discuss that in polite company. It's like, no, that's the fucking point of the book, is that we're going to discuss this. We're gonna have it out in the open, just like Jesse has to have it out in the open. um we have to have a venue for talking about these things, even if they're extremely painful. And I think King is shouldering a lot of responsibility and showing a lot of courage by doing that. And like you said at the beginning, totally fine if that's not your bag and you just wanted to read a book and be entertained. Totally fine. But that is what he's chosen to do with this book.
Yeah,
And
there's definitely a part of me that wonders, like he said over and over again that his first reader is always his wife Tabitha,
mm,
and I do wonder when he handed this manuscript off to Tabby, like was there a moment where she goes, Steve, what the fuck are you doing? Like I wonder what that conversation was like. It's like, are this is what you want to write? This is what you're choosing to do? I think in the world of the story he's constructed, it is absolutely true that we need to see this moment because of the thematic reasons, because of the story reasons, because of the plot reasons. We need to see this. Absolutely true. But like he didn't have to construct the story that way, right?
yeah.
Like this was he this was a man, a middle-aged man choosing very deliberately to tackle something like this, um, intimately and in great detail. Um, and it is a choice. I respect him for this choice because I respect his ability to like say I want to explore these horrible depths of humanity, and I'm going to do it unflinchingly, as you said. I'm going to go full into it. I'm not going to look away. I'm not going to let you look away. But like that's still a choice to like exist in that way. Like,
Mhm.
and man, like like let's just be like I'm not a writer, but even if I was a writer, I could not do this. I could not
Yeah.
do this for my own sake, for the sake of and for my career, for like there's absolutely no way I could ever do this.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, I over the years have written quite a bit, and I'm aware that I can't do this thing that King does, because I flinch before the point of consciousness. Like
Yeah.
I don't even get to the point of thinking like, do I want to write the sexual assault scene? Because it doesn't even occur to me in the first place that that's a subject matter that I want to touch.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
which maybe my subconscious is a coward. I don't know how to think about that. You asked the question about Tabby, which I think is really interesting. Tabitha King, because this is my headcanon about the King family. is that like it's probably overstating it somewhat to say it this way, but I don't think it's overstating it by much to say that King writes for her. Like because it's right good writing advice. I think this may even be somewhere in on writing that it helps to have your specific audience in mind, and by audience I mean specific readers, specific
Mhm.
loved ones, or trusted people whose taste you trust in mind as the people you're writing for. Much easier to write that way, by the way, than writing for the world, because you have no idea what the world likes, but you know what your, you know, best friend or sibling or whatever, what they're gonna like, or
Mhm.
spouse in this case. Um, and so I honestly don't think I think he knows. I think he knows that Tabby is down for this kind of thing. And what I mean by that is like she appreciates the honesty. She appreciates the raw, uh, uh, unsparing detail of confronting these things with open eyes. So I don't think that, and for her part, I don't think she's ever shocked to be like, oh my god, Steve. Like, no,
Yeah.
I think they know each other. I think that's why, to some degree, that's why he's able to write these things. Like, it's kind of a run, you know, almost a running joke that Tabitha King is like partially responsible for his career success.
Yeah.
But like, in a very real sense, a man doesn't write these things unless he knows there's a human being out there who will definitely appreciate it.
Sure.
So I do think in that, I think that's how that dynamic works.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that. I think you're just right there. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
One
Um,
other thing I wanted to point out here, Matt, is that this is the first time that Jesse's voices make their first dramatic appearance in the story, and it is, I think, really interesting. Like, we kind of were primed for this, right? Like, she told us very early in the story that it was this event that caused the voices in her head to appear, but we see them almost right away, right? They show up here immediately, and just immediately become the backdrop of her existence. And I did want to point out something very interesting, that you might not have noticed. One of her voices calls her Tootsie, and we're told specifically that that is a word her mother uses for her. Um, Now the comparison here is Ruth will later call her Toots, right?
mhm,
There's definitely a connection there. Ruth being kind of the 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 hard-nosed tough love person that's going to force you into a situation you're maybe not necessarily comfortable with, but could push you into it possibly. So I wonder if there's a connection there, you know, if the reason why she became so close of a friend with Ruth is because she saw something of her mother in it, and that
mhm.
I don't know, it's just I think that's not an accident.
No, I totally think you're right. I absolutely think you're right that she saw that Ruth was trying to protect her, much like her mother was, but also the way in which Ruth tried to protect her was, from her own perspective, overly aggressive. You know, crossing what she thought were her boundaries, even though Ruth was just trying to help. So,
Yeah, yeah. Anything else you want to say about the eclipse?
um, just, you know, one more thought about the King's choice to go into it in such detail is, you know, not only go through the physical details but go through the psychological details from moment to moment as she's reacting to things, is like it's almost this like matter of fact, um uh, uh just by the numbers detailing at a certain point, and you just want it to be over. You're just like, please, can this be over now? And
Mhm.
I think that's one, like, maybe a minor reason, but perhaps one of the reasons why King wants to kind of drag us through it is to really understand and relate to the fact that, like, hey, you know who else really wants this to be over? Jessie.
Yeah,
uh and and then like that connects back to way earlier in the book when she kind of told herself as an adult, like, that eclipse never ended. The sexual assault, the moment of it ended, but you have been living in this moment for the whole rest of your life until now.
yeah.
And like, when I made that connection, it just kind of knocked me down.
No,
So
I love that. I think that's, yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, it's awful, but I
Yeah.
think you're just yeah, I think that's exactly it, that
Yeah.
it why should you or the reader get the luxury of moving past this? Because
Mhm.
she's been living it her entire life.
Yep.
So once the eclipse is over, it's clear Tom feels a little bit of guilt over what just happened, but he immediately goes into survival mode, and heartbreakingly, so does Jessie. I think that we'll obviously in a few chapters get into what Tom does to her in her room, but like watching her like take a shower, like washing the spunk, which I mean I've never called jizz sperm spunk before, but I think there's something so like that word usage. I don't know. It just it makes it even more disgusting somehow. I don't know. I don't know exactly how that works, but I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the more gross sounding euphemisms for
Yeah,
the yeah.
yeah. Like this moment of realization that she has to go through where she washes her underwear to get the smell off, the stuff off, then has this realization that's like, oh, what do I do if my mom finds like a wet pair of underwear sitting in my hamper? Well, what'll I do? It's like, oh, well, I just tell her I just jumped in the lake swimming. And it's like, oh, well, if that's true, then you need to get the shorts and the t-shirt you were wearing earlier in the day and get those all wet too, or else the lie won't be believable. And it's just this like already having to like craft this multi-layered leveled lie just to get through the day is just so heartbreaking. Like it hurts my heart for her that she
Yeah.
feels that she needs to do this already.
Yeah, I agree. That's like it just is so sad to watch that and understand like this is basically going to be how her mind works for the rest of her life now
Yeah.
because of what her
Mhm.
father just did to her
Yeah.
uh, and he's going to make it worse actually.
Yeah. Oh, so much worse. Yeah. And by the way, this is another place where the voices pack up. Already you're thinking like a criminal, that voice that would one day belong to good wife mourned. Do you see what being a bad girl gets you, Jesse? Do you? I certainly hope you do. And then another voice cuts in. Be quiet, you little creep, the other voice snarled back. Like, yeah, shut up, good wife. But also, this is just now you are a person who is constantly at war with herself. Like, you talked about duality and then like compartmentalization. It's like now eh, how can you exist as a fully functional person in the world when you are fighting yourself internally every moment of every day? You cannot, and she does not. And it happens so quickly after this event. It's like just you're absolutely right what you said earlier. It's like you can see the rest of her life here in this moment already.
Yeah, just starting the practice. She'll get better and better at it until she
Yep.
doesn't even realize she's doing it anymore.
Yep. And then Matt, as we wrap up this chapter, strange things start to happen. So suddenly Jessie kind of has like a psychic event where she sees another woman on her knees looking down a well that Jessie just somehow knows she pushed a man down. She's smelling the same smell that Jessie smelled, which is the smell of the lake, aka it was the sperm. Um, I don't know how much to go into this with you, Matt, because I honestly don't remember if this comes back up again in this book. But essentially, this is our connecting moment to Dolores Claiborne here, Matt. The woman she's seeing is Dolores Claiborne. She's seeing her kill her husband, which happens during the eclipse in that book, the same eclipse. It is this moment of connection. There is also no real spoilers, but there's a moment in Dolores Claiborne where during the eclipse she feels herself psychically connected to a little girl that she sees as being molested by her father. Um, a little girl being molested by their father is a pretty important key point that occurs in Dolores Claiborne as well. Um, it's 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 an interesting moment because it just kind of happens, and it's this way of connecting these two stories together, which I think is fun. I guess fun maybe not the right word, but there's nothing to do with it in this moment. You
Mm,
just kind of don't know where to file this at all.
yeah. Right. So yeah, I mean, I was already aware for whatever reason of this in the story, so it didn't catch me off guard or anything. But as you say, I'm not really sure what we're meant to take away from it. I mean, even if you've read the Dolores Claiborne and you understand all of the ramifications of that, it's like it's not like there's any sort of um comfort being offered to Jessie, or
Yeah,
she doesn't understand this, right? It would be one thing if she understood and like took away some sense of like cosmic justice,
sure.
but for her it's just baffling, and to us it's largely baffling.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, and that's why I was hesitant to talk about it too much because like there's a very real chance that something happens that I just don't remember, which is we come full circle with this at the end of the novel and the connection makes sense and we get to see a resolution on it. I just legitimately don't remember.
yeah, I don't know.
Um,
Don't know what to do with it.
yeah. But our chapter ends with Jessie getting her clothes back on, seeing her father appear suddenly outside her door. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But before we do that, we move on to chapter 19, which leaves that bad memory behind for a bit. Thank God. As Jessie wakes up in the morning, her arms are asleep and not responding to her movement, and she hears flies for the first time coming to eat Gerald. She tries to wake up her arms, and Matt, we get this wonderful kind of extended paragraph about Jessie realizing about accidents and death by misadventure. It's a long paragraph. I won't read it all, but I'll read this part a little bit. So she knew people died in accidents. Of course she knew it. But until now, she had somehow never realized there were people inside those people. People just like her. People who hadn't the slightest idea they would never eat another cheeseburger, watch another round of Final Jeopardy, and please make sure your answer is in the form of a question, or call their best friends to say that penny poker on Thursday night or shopping on Saturday afternoon seemed like a great idea. No more beer, no more kisses, and your fantasy of making love in a hammock during a thunderstorm was never going to be fulfilled because you were going to be too busy being dead. Any morning you rolled out of bed might be your last. So I love this as just like a general idea of like, we never know the situations we're going to get ourselves in. But I also really like, there's a part of me that believes King is speaking to the audience a bit here because we hear horror stories like the story that happens in this book all the time of people being raped or sexually assaulted by their family or murdered by their family or just sexual assault in general, right? We hear these stories, we watch the news, we see these things, and they're awful and we see them as awful, but it is also very easy for us and very like human to how our brain works of divorcing the humanity from that, because it's like you just go, oh, that's a shitty thing that happened, that sucks, and then you just kind of move on with your day, right? And what King has done with this book is essentially created a situation in which you have to see that there's people inside those people. Here's one of those people. This is what it was like for this girl to go through this. So the next time you hear the story about a father molesting their child, like, remember the detail of this moment because that's what that little girl went through.
Yeah. Um, I like that. I love King's phrasing of she had somehow never realized there were people inside those people.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
which it almost strikes you as absurd, but it resonates somehow too. It's actually very painful to walk around remembering all the time that there are people inside the people that you're encountering,
sure, yeah,
because that forces you to be to feel a lot of pain. And so I think we all, I don't know. I feel like it's a fairly typical coping mechanism to kind of willfully forget that fact.
yeah. I,
Um,
I think I think there's a, I don't know, there's a level of which you have to do that to survive and live in the world because the
mhm.
world is awful and terrible things happen literally every second of every day. Sure, but I also think there is a way to become so desensitized and removed from it that it stops meaning anything to you. Um,
Yeah.
and I think there's a happy middle ground there where we can remember these people are people, but obviously, yeah, we can't be knocked over by every event, or we just won't be able to live.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. And I think what King is doing is he's tactically shoving that defense mechanism aside for just a second and being like, hey, this is a fictional character, but remember that, like you just said a second ago, this kind of thing happens to people all the time.
Hmm.
And it is exactly this horrible for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that I agree with that, and then another thing that's happening plot wise is like Jesse in this moment is really coming to grips with the grim reality of her situation and
Yeah.
like starting to feel a certainty that like if I don't get out of this myself somehow, I'm going to die. And it's becoming less like emotional and more just like a reality
Yep.
that she can't escape.
Yep.
So
Yep. Totally. So Jesse tries praying to God, but as we all know, God is cruel. So the only voices she hears in her head are her own. That was a. I just realized we have people might that listening that might not know that's a desperation reference and are just saying I'm being incredibly sacrilegious
uh,
randomly. Um, yeah, that's from Stephen King's Desperation. She begins to pedal and try to wake her legs up and get the blood pumping as the voices in her head battle each other. I do think there is this kind of perfect matching here, Matt, as she physically battles with her body to get it back to moving, as the voices in her head are kind of mentally battling with each other. I think there's again, I think this is intentionally designed by King to mirror each other.
totally. Yeah, I agree. It's a I mean, I don't know how many pages we have left, but it feels like the inner struggle of Jesse is building towards something like a climax, and it makes sense that like the next chapter, or I don't know, between now and the end of this conversation, basically, we're gonna hit a very important inflection point for her where she realizes something, right?
Yeah.
So we're building toward that.
Yep. Yep. All right. Chapter 20. Jessie works through the worst of her cramps and finds that she's calmed down enough and is ready to suss out her problem again. She starts by grabbing her glass of water and taking those last few drops, which do help wake her up, Matt. So you were just stupid and wrong about
For sure, for
she
sure.
shouldn't have drank all the water because she needed these little drops, Matt.
She needed the drops.
You don't know nothing.
Oh, you're right, Scott.
I do love this little part, Matt, where Jesse decides to put the glass back almost without thinking, decides to put the glass back where she found it, not just kind of carelessly drop it on the floor because, quote, neatness counts, something taught to her by, of all people, her mother.
Hmm. This won't be important at all.
No, definitely not. This leads us, though, Matt, to for the first time in the book, Jesse thinking about her mother in the present tense. We learn here she's still alive. She's living out in Arizona, occasionally sending her mom letters of just doing's great here. I think what we see here is that her relationship with her mother is pretty broken, right? She, not a great relationship with her mom. Uh, Very understandable that that is the case. As we said, Tom kind of fostered that himself, but then also there was this thing between them, which if our subtextual read is correct, it's a thing that Jesse definitely knows about, but perhaps it is a thing that her mother suspects as well. I really loved this line here. Mom, did you forget the day you threw that shoes at me and broke my favorite vase? And I cried because I thought you must know that he must have finally broken down and told you, even though it had been 3 years since the day of the eclipse by then. Did you forget how often you scared us with your screams and your tears? See, I mean, I do think this is a woman that just suspects things and it's destroying her. And it's, damaging her relationship with her husband, obviously, but also with her children, especially the child that she suspects something happened with.
I think you're right. And, she has no evidence. She has no. Uh, I think she's been thoroughly gaslit by this horrible husband of hers. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
I think you're right.
Um, that leads her to realize that her mother would have absolutely believed her if she went to her with what happened the day of the eclipse. And she realizes that her father absolutely knew that too. And this is like what kind of causes the dominoes to fall to where Jesse finally realizes, quote, her father used her in more than one way that day. Um, which is just a powerful moment of realization there.
Yeah,
But I, I do think it is interesting that we end the chapter after that moment of realization of her basically going, but what happened on the deck that day actually wasn't that bad. Like the quote is, but what happened on the deck that day was really just another accident and not a very serious one at that. Um,
yeah.
And her voices yell at her for this. Let's give the other parts of her mind credit for being like, why are you still covering for him?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the strongest parts of this book is the psychological realism, where one thing that human beings don't actually do is we don't like have a realization, and then suddenly we just like, I I've had a catharsis, like a character in a Greek play, and I am better now, and I will never. I'm different now. No, it's always incremental, and you've still got the lingering remnants of the parts that were active for 30 years
Yeah.
that need to be metabolized. So, yeah, she's had an important realization. She's has yet more important realizations to make by the time we're done talking today. And so, yes, you're totally right. It's realistic that she would still be trying to minimize this thing, but like you just said, there are more voices who are like starting to call her on the bullshit,
Yeah.
which is not was not happening before.
Yeah. I also think it's one thing to kind of realize her dad manipulated her, and then it's another when what we do in the next chapter is we get to see it, and so she gets
Yeah.
to live through that experience, which is going to change things up.
Yep.
All right, well, let's get to that. Chapter 21, which I like. Obviously, like, he molests his daughter. Like, that's disgusting and awful. There are many ways in which what he does in this scene is I mean, like, we don't have to score, but like almost as bad, worse maybe. I don't know.
It strikes me as being more evil,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
that makes any sense. Because what it is it's um kind of something I tried to say last week, which is like it's taking what should be a sacred responsibility. If the word sacred means anything, then being a father is a sacred thing.
hmm
Um and like perverting and warping and abusing that to to just the most selfish possible ends, which to me I'm just like, okay, that's evil. That's evil.
yeah,
That's what evil is.
yeah. I mean, like, you could imagine a world in which this man did this terrible thing, felt legitimately awful about it, like, came clean. Obviously, this would lead to the family breaking apart, maybe him going to prison. Good. Um, and like, you wouldn't like forgive him for that thing, but you could at least say like, you at least like became a father again briefly by like taking responsibility for what you did and owning up to it and taking the consequences of that and living with them. Like, I again, I'd still hate him, but I would be like, hey, at least you did that.
Right.
Um, but that's not what happens here.
Well,
What happens
eh,
here is he doubles down on everything.
to do ethics corner for a moment, which is always fraught. I understand. Like, there's like the level of like it's just more virtuous to be honest and to be honorable,
Yeah,
and to just like you said, come clean. Like it's you're just a better person if you do that,
yeah,
versus you just. And if you don't do that, in contrast, then like, okay, great. Now you get to live the rest of your life as a weasel who
yeah,
is a perpetually running away from this moment. I mean, it's interesting because I feel like we don't really see this, but in much the same way that she spends the rest of her life in this eclipse, I think maybe part of him spends the rest of his life in in this eclipse, because he has this secret hanging over him that could destroy his life if it's ever revealed at any moment, right? If she ever decides, if she ever changes her mind, right? Um, and then just like, okay, so that's virtue ethics. Consequentialist ethics would just be like, yes, he could actually mitigate some of the damage he's done if he helps her through this and takes the responsibility, and doesn't make it all her responsibility, right? She could much more effectively, I think, heal from this and come to a place of understanding of and truth, and
yeah, yeah,
he doesn't do any of that. So yeah, just terrible.
yeah. It's awful. Um, So there is a small moment at the beginning here where Jessie allows herself to have the appropriate reaction to these events. She's ashamed and terrified, but aware that she didn't deserve this. This is his fault. He was supposed to be the one that's ashamed, not her, but he's not. He's not acting ashamed. But as will become her modus operandi, she banishes that thought, quote, back to its cave. That thought doesn't work. So it doesn't help me. So it's getting out of here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the way he manipulates the situation is he frames it where the most comfortable course of action for everyone is to pretend that it didn't happen,
Hmm.
where comfortable is in scare quotes here. But
Yeah.
it, like, obviously it's the most convenient for him. And then for her part, as a child who doesn't really understand the way the world works, she thinks, yeah, I definitely think I will suffer less if I just keep this a secret, because then the family will stay together, and everything will be fine. I'll just keep it a secret forever and everything will be fine. Actually, that sounds great in contrast to imagining uh my mom hating me. But because she's a child, she's not aware that what she has just agreed to is just absorbing a lifetime of suffering into her
Yeah.
soul,
Yeah.
um, cramming it in there because she doesn't understand that.
Yeah. I agree. One thing I do want to point out here stylistically is it's something that probably you didn't notice because it's not an audiobook thing, but in the sexual assault scenes, in the actual scene of the eclipse, all the dialogue, at least all of Tom's dialogue, is done via italics. When Tom talks in those scenes, it's just italicized words, not dialogue quotes. It's similar to how the voices in Jesse's head talk, by the way. When
Mm.
these voices in Jesse's head talk, it's all in italics. It's not in dialogue. But here in this scene, in this sequence, it is normal dialogue. I do think that this shows like a pretty important shift into how Jesse is processing and understanding these things. It's not reliving it as if it's a dream or a voice in her head of her father of what he said that day. She's actively processing that. And we'll see here in a second when we halfway through the scene, we cut to adult Jesse reliving these moments. Consciously, which again, I think we're not seeing this from the point of view of child Jesse experiencing all these things and not fully understanding what they are. We're seeing this moment from the perspective of adult Jesse, who sees this all for exactly what it is.
Yeah. But one thought I had is like, it's kind of like this is the first time she's hearing this, and that's
Hmm.
why it's in quotes.
Yeah,
I like that idea. Yeah.
yeah, no, I like that. Um, so then we get this. They're talking about whether they should tell the her mother, and Tom says, I hate to, he said, because things have been pretty tense between the two of us just lately, hun. A thing like this can make them a lot worse. She hasn't been very affectionate lately. And that was most of the problem today. A man has certain needs. You'll understand that someday. But if she finds out, she'll say it was my fault. Oh, no, I don't think so, Tom said, but his tone was surprised, considering, and to Jesse as dreadful as a death sentence. No, I'm sure, fairly sure that she. Matt, is it possible for me to murder a fictional character? Can I do that? Can I just do that?
Scott, that's what fan fiction is for.
Yeah. Okay, hang on. Let me just do. Gonna close my eyes
Yeah.
and
I think no, that's not going to do it, man.
no, no.
You got to write us, you know, The Equalizer starring Denzel Washington.
Uh huh.
You're gonna write a The Equalizer / Gerald's Game crossover fic. I think this would be good for you.
No, I'm doing it in my head right. Up, up.
Is there
Yep,
a
he's dead.
hammer? Does he have a
He's
hammer?
dead. Yeah. Oh, there was several hammers.
Okay, good.
Got him. Um, yeah, I like again, fantastic job, Stephen, in your writing of this whole exchange because it is so fucking despicable. Like, how dare you? Like
Hmm.
the level of manipulation. I'm speechless.
Yeah, right. He knows exactly what buttons to push to ensure that she never talks about this at the
Yep.
cost, of course, of internalizing the idea that this is actually her fault. Like that,
Mhm.
to say it out loud, that's the critical ingredient in this actually working, is that he gets her to believe this is her fault and that her mom will hate her for quote unquote doing this.
Yeah. Yeah. That was most of the problem today, that her mom hasn't been very affectionate lately. If it's not
God.
if it's not
Yeah,
it's not Jess if it's not Jesse's fault, well, then it's my wife's fault because she hasn't been sleeping with me enough. So this
right,
I have to do this.
right.
Fucking asshole. Okay, chapter
Yeah.
22. This is the moment, by the way, that I just spoke to before. We cut. We start a new chapter here specifically because we are moving now from living in the past, being in the scene in 1963. Now we are with Jessie in bed, handcuffed here, and in fact, one of the things that Tom says to her in the scene, we see comes from her as actual just dialogue from her saying it out loud for the first time. And I agree with what you said earlier, that this idea that perhaps this is her really hearing some of the stuff for the first time
Mhm. Yeah,
in
or
her mind, at least.
at least like
Hearing it,
adult.
like,
Yeah.
understanding it for the first time, yeah.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page there, yeah.
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 So
Um,
her sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, that's fine, yeah.
Her father makes her promise not to tell anyone ever, not just mom, by the way, but not her friends, not her sister Maddie, nobody. Um, and I like, we kind of talked last week about, hey, isn't it weird that she doesn't really talk about Maddie at all? And it's very clear that she doesn't have a close relationship with Maddie. And this is why, right? Is because her father, in doing what he did, made sure she can never get close with any friends, because she can't ever tell any of her friends. And also her sister, who she was very close with, she can't anymore.
Yeah.
If you get too close to her, she'll suspect or she'll find out. So you've just not only destroyed your daughter's life, but you've completely eviscerated any kind of support system she could possibly have.
Yeah, it's like that poison in the well inside her is becoming clear, right? It's
Yep.
poisoned everything, poisoned all of her relationships. And of course, she didn't realize that was going to happen when she was a little girl, but that is what has happened.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
I think it's very clever of Tom in a low and awful sense that like much of his manipulation just hinges on the fact that this is his loving daughter who, even in this situation, still sees the best in him and still loves him. Even though there's part of her that hates him, she still loves him. He's still her daddy.
Yeah, it's because it's her fucking dad. Like
Yeah,
this is the outrageously horrible worst part of this whole thing is you're her father. Like as you said, like a sacred fucking responsibility
yeah,
as a parent.
right.
Mm. Matt, I'm mad. I'm
Yep, me
really
too.
pissed off right now. I'm really fucking mad. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very
These characters
upsetting.
aren't real and I'm so mad.
Me too. I agree.
Um oh, speaking of being mad, you
Uh huh.
know, you've got an awful lot of power for a little girl, Pumpkin. Oh, look, hold on. Yep, I just killed him again. Yeah, it
Yeah, good.
was great.
You can. That's the great thing about fan fiction is you
Mhm,
can put it back
mhm.
together and then do it all over again. Yeah.
Yep, yep.
Um,
What a fucking terrible thing to say to a human being. Holy shit.
yeah, just basically just piling on this idea that it's she's the one with the power. This is your decision. This is your responsibility. This is your fault. You're the one who's choosing this course of action. You're choosing to keep this a secret. 100% of what I just said is false. It's all him putting these ideas into her head and then
Yep.
saying, "Wow, great job, honey. You decided what to do here, and this is your, put a nice little bow on the whole thing for
Yeah. Mhm. So
her."
at the end, Tom, unable to look his daughter in the eyes, apologizes and blames the eclipse.
Yeah, it was my wife and the eclipse.
Yeah. He stifles a laugh of relief when his daughter asks him if she might be pregnant from what he did. What does he do to that? He stifles a laugh of relief. Holy shit. What a
Yeah.
scumbag.
So maybe I'm like projecting onto this situation because I don't want to acknowledge how evil he is. But like, was there implied in that like a flicker of like him realizing how innocent she is that she would say that, and that being kind of intrinsically horrifying?
So, child Jesse's interpretation of the scene is that, yeah, he has this moment of where he kind of chokes on his words a little bit. And her interpretation of that was guilt at how um clearly innocent she was, that she doesn't even understand the stuff of what have I done? I'm a monster. It is adult Jesse looking back on this sequence that now wonders if what he was actually doing was just stifling a relieved laugh,
Uh-huh.
um, because he knows he's won. So
Yeah.
like I don't
Okay.
know.
Okay.
It's interesting to think of like which is the quote unquote accurate read of him. Um,
I, I mean, you're right. And now that you say that, I remember it. Although I think my brain almost latched on to little Jesse's perspective as just being like less horrible. Um,
yeah,
but but um, but I think Elder Jesse is correct. Uh, and if anything, it was just younger Jesse still wanting to believe the best in him that led to her thinking that.
yeah, I think so. Yeah. All right. So then we get this. Even when I graduated from college, the only other time I saw him cry over me, he gave me one of those funny old maid hugs. The kind you do with your ass pooching out so there isn't ever any chance you can bump crotches with the person you're hugging. Poor, poor man. I wonder if any of the people he did business with over the years saw him as rattled as I saw him on the day of the eclipse. All that pain. And over what? A sexual accident about as serious as a stub toe? Jesus, what a life it is. What a fucking life. Jesse. See, again, because Matt, we got to live this beat by beat, moment by moment, second by excruciating second. We can read that sentence and without any doubt of certainty go, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah. Right. So we're not going to talk about it explicitly, but like we saw what happened. He did a lot of stuff that was not that like no matter how hard you're squinting, accident does not characterize it.
No,
I wanted to say at some point in here, like that what happens in the book is kind of different from what happens in the movie. I think, unless I'm misremembering the movie.
I don't have a clear enough memory.
Well, like they're different, but like they're both horrible, but they're
Sure.
different. And they're both but like the way in which they're similar is that they don't really brook any ambiguity that it was uh horrible.
Yeah.
And not like an accident. I don't know. I'm triggered by the use of the word accident as if it's like, oh, he didn't mean to. It's like,
Yeah.
what are you talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. And fortunately, the voices in her head protest this as well as us. She tries to push them away, and then Bryant Gumbel shows up as well to interview her. She manages to push him away, but finally, the voice of Nora Callaghan, her therapist, shows up to ask her one final question to wrap up the chapter. When she kicked Gerald yesterday, who was she actually kicking? And that's when the realization that the spit that fell down from Gerald's chin onto her midriff for a brief moment didn't look like spit, but like spunk. And we actually see, I went back and checked, like that she does say this right before she kicks him. She says, spunk, it's his spunk. And then she
Mhm.
kicks him. So we didn't quite understand the context of that at that moment, although I think we could have made a few educated guesses. But that is what triggers her to finally lash out, kick him in the balls, and lead to his heart attack and death.
Yeah.
So I guess the question I have here, and I want to be careful, like I am not excusing Gerald for any of his, as you said, like walking up to the line and seeing how close to the line he can get and enjoying sexual pleasure from that without her consent. Definitely not. But do we pity Gerald in any way? Like, he had no idea, no earthly idea what he was messing with here. He got into a mess he definitely didn't fully understand.
I mean, I think that's the complicated nature of being human is like we're all, you know, deserving of pity, but also flawed. Like, I don't know, man. I if you're asking if I feel pity for Gerald, like a little tiny bit, because like I think Gerald is just like hapless.
Yeah,
The
I
word
think
the word
that's a
hapless I
good
think
word.
applies, which is not a compliment. Like it's not like
Sure.
it's just like you didn't understand, you didn't understand what you were really getting into, and that doesn't absolve you, but we can feel like you didn't deserve to die, I don't think. Um, but you should have listened better. You should have been more perceptive to what was going on with your wife, obviously, at not just in that moment, but during the 20 years leading up to that moment, actually.
Sure. Yeah. No,
Um,
absolutely true. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I don't want to make it seem like I'm letting Gerald off the hook. Certainly not. But yeah, and like I think she feels a little pity for Gerald in this moment as she comes to realize maybe that's what I'm just pinging off of is
yeah,
her. She looks down at his corpse and is like, "Oh, you didn't even know."
yeah. Right, right. I mean, I think Gerald, there are these lines drawn between Gerald and the dog and the father and the man made of moonlight, and the lines are not meant to say these are all the same, but they are connections. There's a thread.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that the dog is an interesting case. I think because the dog, we can kind of set down some of our like reticence to say we pity the dog. It's like I pity the dog. It's a
Yeah.
dog.
Yeah.
Of course you pitied the dog. It's a dog. It's just trying to survive. The dog wants to eat. It sees some meat. It's going to eat the meat. We may feel a
Mhm.
little weird about it, but it needs to survive. And then like the gradient. So there's like a gradient from dog to Gerald, and then to Tom, and then possibly to the man made out of moonlight. I don't actually know. By the way, I don't like remember if the man made out of moonlight is actually like evil or if he just likes to go into people's houses and look at them. Um,
He's got a case filled with bones, Matt.
maybe he found that case. But that's kind of how I see it. Is the book begins with that epigraph saying men are pigs, and it's a common enough saying that men are dogs,
Mhm.
where the implication of both of these statements is basically men are driven by animal drives,
Yeah.
and they're gross. So
Yeah. Yeah. Agree. As a man,
yeah,
totally. I'm desperately trying to make jokes here because I'm just so incredibly uncomfortable.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, let's move on.
Okay,
Chapter 23. So we reached this chapter, Matt. The past has been fully unburied. So now it's time to get out of these fucking handcuffs, right?
yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Um,
Decide
how?
decide to get out of the handcuffs now, Jesse.
Okay. So Jessie works through a few things in these decisions. Well, maybe she could reach the keys. Nope, can't do that. Maybe she can reach the phone. Nope, can't do that. She tries to kind of slide off the bed in order to push it in one direction or another, but actually that hurts her a great deal and kind of proves that it's essentially impossible. Um, I did want to point this line out as another instance of me perhaps reading too much meaning into things, but there is this line that says, without thinking about it or planning it, unless the body, goaded by pain, sometimes thinks for itself. Jessie braced her bare left heel on the floor and shoved backward with all her might. Don't you think that's kind of what her brain is doing as well? Like the brain, goaded by pain, sometimes just thinks for itself and decides how we're going to process this information. Like, do I think Jessie consciously decided I was going to push this stuff out of my head and never think about it again? Or is that just this automatic subconscious survival mechanism that I just employed immediately?
No, that's great. I think that's a fantastic connection. Um, because I think we're very, what the book is doing is literalizing the psychological struggle with this mental struggle in the first place. So I think
Yep.
that's a
Yeah.
that's a great connection. Just to say it, I think it's really interesting that she, none of these things work, right? But
Hmm.
the fact that she never tried these things before is really telling. Like you just said, it's not until she has this kind of mental self confrontation that she even tries this list of things.
Yep. Yep. She also tries to do like a backwards somersault or
Hmm.
think about it, and then quickly realizes that would just immediately break her wrists and she'd just be stuck.
Right.
So she is like really just stuck, right? Like now we've 250 pages into the novel, exhausted all things she can think of finally, and we're gonna have to figure out how the heck to get out of here.
Yep.
So Matt, what do you think? There's this kind of dropped in the middle here is this reveal that she got very close to sleeping with a man named Tommy Del Guidance at a Christmas party at one point. This would have been after she's married to Gerald, so it would have been an affair. It just seems to come out of nowhere. And like very casually by Jessie dropped. It's like, oh yeah, that one time that I almost had an affair.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what to do with it. My first and only thought is like this is kind of the only time that we've seen her have um like any kind of healthy lust.
Mm-hmm.
Like with she obviously had sex with Gerald, but it kind of seemed like she was like the passive recipient of sex.
Yeah. I mean, she did reference it last week. I don't you recall, like she referenced memories of when he, like, gave her so much pleasure. She like screamed in pleasure at some like the best
Yeah,
orgasm she's ever had. Like that's the fascinating contradiction of people is that we can have this terrible stuff that we are living with that destroys us, but can still function on some level still.
yeah, right. So I agree with that, and I remember that but we never really saw a moment of her like lusting after Gerald.
Yeah, true.
Uh,
Very true.
but and this is her like wanting to have sex, not just. I think there's a difference between wanting to have sex and enjoying sex that is happening to her. I
Hmm.
guess is what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. All right, Matt, chapter 24, our final chapter of the week. Jessie is asleep again and dreaming, not of the past anymore, but of the future. I think that's an important distinction too, right? Like she's thinking about what's going to happen, not what happened.
Yep.
The and she's dreaming about what? The Moonlight Man, a cosmic wild card, the space cowboy, death itself. And later that night, he would be back and, as she suspects, not just stand in the corner watching anymore. She wakes up from this trying to convince herself it was all a dream, just like the last time it was all a dream. The voices start talking to her again, trying to push her towards not towards looking to the past, but looking towards her future. Uh, think about one day they're going to find a dead, still handcuffed you to this bed, and they're probably not going to notice that your wedding ring is missing and maybe one of the bones off your toe is missing because they've joined the Moonlight Man's bag that he just found, as you said, Matt. So I find this all incredibly effective in like as a way of like wrapping up. You've been all through all this stuff, and let's go now. Let's go.
Yeah.
Um, you've exhausted some of the options, but you're gonna have to figure something out.
Yes, I agree. It's a fantastic statement, and it feels very much like okay, we're moving into the third act. Is what I
Yeah.
would say.
Yep. Finally, Jessie slams her head against the headboard to knock the voices out of her head. And when she does this, she notices something glint in the morning sunlight, a lone earring on the floor, and a muddy footprint. Jessie finally accepts the truth of what happened last night and 29 years ago simultaneously. And our chapter ends with her screaming as Prince raises his head and is like, "What's her deal?"
Yeah.
And we
With
so we
what?
cut we cut away.
Mm.
All right, Matt. So I know you know if and how Jessie is going to get out of the situation. So I can't ask that question as we leave this week's reading. But I think you're totally just correct that we've gone through everything. We've looked at the past. We've seen it. We might still have a little bit more traveling to the past to do. We'll see. There could be some more events maybe in the aftermath of the eclipse that we haven't seen yet, but she's encountered the worst two moments, I guess, and now she's got to figure out how the hell to get out of this thing. And I think importantly, I think we're still missing. I think you're right that the connection there was like, okay, the part of the way this is going to help her escape is because now she could maybe learn to forgive herself and stop blaming herself and therefore love herself, um, and not be actively sabotaging herself in this situation she's in. But it still doesn't like, okay, but how are you going to get out though? And
Right.
we're still missing that.
Yes, and that's something I'm excited about because I don't remember if the movie. It's been a long time since we watched the movie. I don't remember how the movie deals with this, and I don't know what the connective tissue is, like you just said, between the internal realization and the external figuring it out. You
Yeah.
know, so
There is one in the movie. I do not remember if that same connecting tissue exists in the novel. So I'm I'm with you on this right now where I honestly don't know and we'll have to see. I don't
cool,
remember.
awesome.
But that is chapter 24 and that's going to do it for this week's reading. As we mentioned at the beginning of the show, next week it will be our fourth episode and our penultimate episode reading chapters 25 through 33 of the novel. And then we'll finish it the week after that. So we're moving right along. I'm excited.
I'm very excited.
All right, Matt, it's time for some discussion questions. What was the question we asked our listeners on the very first episode of Gerald's Game those many, many days ago?
Question was, what is your favorite trapped in a bad situation story?
We got a lot of great answers for this one, I
Yes.
think.
I kept thinking, damn, we're in a tight spot from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Um, but from Karina 2020, my first thought for this week's question is Paul Sheldon from Misery. In the book, the poor guy loses body parts and is just basically terrorized by Annie Wilkes. It is such a brutal novel, but so good.
That's a perfect answer. I agree.
Yeah, and it's sort of another chain to the bed story, actually. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. This is one that you also haven't read, but have seen the film on, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Next, we have Para Jane, who starts off by complimenting us. I'm not going to read that because it makes me feel awkward, but thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Basically saying she thinks we're handling the sensitive content of the book respectfully, which I hope people still think that after these additional two episodes. We are trying very, very hard, very, very conscious of how difficult and awful this is, especially, again, as we are not women, right?
Right.
Um, so I hope you still feel that way. I hope you all do. And if not, let us know because I want to learn always. So, um, all right. Parajane's answer is I was delighted when my eighth grader recently said, I think I'd like to watch Severance. 2 grueling weeks later, and we're all caught up and have to wait every week like 20th century ancients for the next episode. As the innies of Lumos begin understanding the philosophical reality of their lives, they have to grapple with the fact that not only are they their own jailers, but that everything outside the walls of the severed floor is a vast unknown. They're adults, but they're also children. They have knowledge, but no experience. Their unique circumstances led my kid, who is also a first class scout, to shout at one point, "This is dangerous. They know nothing about fire safety."
That's great.
That's really great. Yeah, we love Severance.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have actually thought of it as a stuck in a bad situation story, but it totally is
It
in so
definitely is.
many
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. By the way, if you want to hear our thoughts on Severance, we are on the Doofcast every week since the show started coming out. We finish the episode by talking about the most recent episode of Severance. I think we're going to eventually cut all that together into like once the season's done, like a Severance supercut, and we'll release that as well. Because
Yeah,
some of that gets buried behind an Oscar movie that no one's going to listen to our episode on because how many people have seen The Brutalist, a wonderful, wonderful film that more people should see, but
right.
understandable that you haven't.
Yeah, I think on many podcatchers you can just like skip to that part of the conversation, right?
Um,
I
I
I
got
thought maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I used to do that, and I got lazy, and I haven't been putting timestamps in the
Okay. Well,
shows.
sometimes YouTube is just smart enough to break things into segments on its own. But
I always assumed
anyway,
that was people doing that. Is it not?
I thought it was done algorithmically.
That would be
Um,
cool.
I don't know, but we are talking about Severance on the
Yeah.
Doofcast. Is the point? All right. Steve Living Room says, I got to go with the whole town in King's Under the Dome. Another epic tale from the master storyteller, especially Dale, Barbara, or Barbie, as his friends call him, is a great main character stuck in a town he wanted to leave. Don't listen to the haters about the ending. I think it was perfect.
I didn't hate the ending as much as other people did either, Steve. Matt, this is another one I got very close to putting on our season 3 list, Under the Dome. I think it's a really good book. It's a big doorstopper. It's long. It's great.
I feel like I've heard it compared to Needful Things, which makes me really want to read it.
I could see that, I guess. Yeah.
Town tears itself apart story.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Well, there's a dome, man.
There's, I gotcha.
Next, we have Baby Can You Dig Your Sam, who says, so many Stephen King stories involve being trapped. Gerald's Game, The Shining, The Mist, Under the Dome, Misery, Firestarter, 1408, etc. That's actually true. There are quite a few of them. I guess being trapped is scary, so I get it.
Yeah.
Of course, on the TV spectrum, there's also Lost, From, The Prisoner, Yellow Jackets, and Silo, just to name a few. If you're not watching and listening to Scott and Matt's From podcast, you should. Thank you for the plug, Sam. I think that will be out when this episode comes out, actually. So
Yeah.
perfectly timed. As a diehard Lost fan, I would probably go that with my favorite. That being said, the story that first jumped into my mind was the German film Funny Games. This is an exceptional movie, but if you have not watched the movie, don't. Unless you lack any form of empathy, this movie is brutal. A Leopold and Loeb type duo terrorizes a family of 3. There is no happy ending. No one escapes the trap. It is by far the most disturbing movie I've ever seen. An Americanized version starring Naomi Watts was eventually released. Why? I have never watched this version, as I would never put myself through that experience again. As someone who has seen the German film Funny Games, I agree.
Yeah.
It's not a bad movie. It's just an awful movie.
Yeah. It's just a movie that is bad. I have not, although, no, that was a different thing. We were talking about that the other day. So the Strangers was like a riff on that premise, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just don't. You don't have to. You don't have to watch it.
Yeah. And you also don't have to open the door to strangers.
But you will.
You will. They'll have such a good excuse. That's what always happens. All right. Ruth Jess, new commenter, I believe, and a name that seems to be inspired by the book we're covering, says, Cujo, for me, the idea of being trapped with a child and watching them die messes me up, closely followed by Misery. Also, I'm with Matt. Prince can chow down all he likes on the pile of feces that is Gerald. I loosely acknowledge the similarity between Gerald meeting his need regardless of Jessie's feelings and the dog meeting his own needs despite her obvious anger. However, I think it's important we separate Gerald's need, horniness, from the dog's need, hunger, and actual need. No one has ever died of blue balls, but living organisms can die of starvation. Prince is just trying to survive. He is the victim of a selfish human, and I would adopt him in a heartbeat, even knowing what he has done. Sorry you have to see it, Jessie, but I can't demonize the dog for avoiding death. Gerald is an absolute scumbag, not a monster, but a regular old human scumbag, and he didn't deserve a beautiful, heartfelt burial. In fact, I think becoming dog food is probably too good for him. Well, tell us what you really think, Jess. No, that's great. I like a lot about this comment. For some reason, it's always a pet peeve with me when people refer to sexual needs as needs in a way that equates them to like, you will die if you don't get this.
Yeah.
Like I often find it to be used almost always.
It's used exactly the way Tom uses it.
Yes.
In this week's reading. Yeah.
Yes. Like I get sometimes people are using it like more or less innocently, but very often it's used manipulatively where it's like, I didn't have a choice. It's like, fuck you, you had a choice.
Yeah.
Whatever it was, you had a choice. It's not a need. It's a desire. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm done. Soapbox over.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think we were trying to draw the lines between the men in the story and their needs being met, but I think I again, I don't think it's an accident that, yeah, like, we have a dog who does have an actual physical need, is an animal who is acting on a physical need, versus two human beings that are supposed to be better than animals, more
Mhm.
civilized than animals, acting on not a physical need, but an entirely mental derived need of their own. Yeah. I still don't like want to see a dude get eaten by a dog. I think that's like I'm not saying he has to have like a good Christian burial or anything. I just don't particularly want to watch a man being devoured. I will say, like, a dog could eat Tom, I think. In fact, hold on. Yep, there we go.
See? See? Now the real question, Scott. Desert island, no food around.
Okay.
Tom,
Would I eat Tom?
would you eat Tom?
No.
Oh, okay. I'd eat Tom.
I really think the long-term reveal is you are just an actual functioning cannibal, and
Just just
like,
just looking for an excuse.
I don't like I Tom is so gross that I don't think I could eat him.
Interesting.
Yeah. I feel like I would be eating some of his sin.
That's a fascinating psychological statement that you've just said.
I haven't thought about it very much, so
I love it. I love it.
I really didn't think cannibalism was going to be as a hot button topic for Gerald's game, but here we are.
It's the crux.
Yeah. Maybe Jessie can just eat herself. Oh, but she can't get anything up to her teeth. That's the problem.
Yeah,
See, she would have, except for that.
she would have. Yeah.
Yeah. Last but not least, we have Apocalypse Win, who says Stephen King has so many examples of people being trapped in bad situations, but the one that stuck in my mind the hardest is his short story, The Jaunt. Humans have developed technology for instant teleportation, allowing them to colonize the solar system. The only catch is it's very important to be rendered unconscious, because while the teleportation is physically instant, the conscious mind perceives it as unfathomably long time spent in a white expanse of nothingness. Take 3 guesses at what happens to the main character's son at the end of the story. The thought of being trapped in a void with only your thoughts, perhaps millions of years, is the apex existential nightmare. I don't know if you've read that short story. I think we just kind of spoiled it for you, but
Have not.
it's
It's
pretty. You
okay.
should go read it. It's pretty great.
I'll go ahead and use my typical ritual, which is just living my life, and then I forget everything. Um, uh, there's this reminds me of things that happen in Worm as well, which is
Yeah,
there's a lot of horror to be mined from just like being stuck with
certainly.
nothing
Yeah,
nothing to do. Yeah.
yeah. All right, that is it. Thank you for all those great answers and all the other ones that we saw. That was really, really great. I appreciate you all engaging with the question and talking about it. Really enjoy it, and I think this is going to be a good one as well. This is, I think, maybe perhaps a bit more serious and complicated of a question, but I think it's one worth having, which is why we're asking it.
Yeah.
Matt, what is this next question?
What's the most uncomfortable you've ever been made by reading or watching something? Do these moments have value in storytelling?
Oh man, we're getting philosophical.
Yeah, this is I like the second part of this question because, like we'd mentioned at the start of this conversation, um, you know, why the why of it I think matters, right? Um,
Yeah.
so I'll leave that open ended. Let people
Mm-hmm.
do what they want.
All right, that is going to do it for us this week. As we said, next week, Gerald's Game will continue with chapters 25 through 33 of the novel. It's about another 80 something pages for y'all to read and us to talk about.
Yeah. Remember, you can reach us via email at flanaganswakepod@gmail.com, on Twitter at flanagan'swake19, on the Reddit at reddit.com/r/doofmedia. That's probably the best place to answer that discussion question and check out what other cool things are happening. Good place to visit for recent Flanagan / King / whatever's up your alley news. Blue Sky, Flanagan's Wake Pod, and on Instagram, we're at Doof Media. Also, don't forget that every episode can now be found on YouTube in video format. So if you're watching us on YouTube, please leave us a comment letting us know what you think.
Yeah. I think these episodes covering books will be, by definition, less visual because we don't have film clips to put in them. But still, get in the habit of watching on YouTube. So when we cover Gerald's Game, the movie, we can watch the clips together as we talk about them.
That's right.
All right. Merch. I remember what I was supposed to say at the very last minute. We have a merch store. It's doofmedia.myshopify.com, where we have mugs, shirts, everything for every show that we have. Just a way of kind of supporting us a little bit and also getting some cool merch. We really like the logo of Flanagan's Wake. I'm really enjoying it. And you can too. So grab a mug, grab a shirt, grab a sweater, grab them all.
Grab one of each.
Yeah.
And if you enjoy Flanagan's Wake and you want to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/doofmedia. The aforementioned From bonus podcast should be out by the time you're listening to this.
Yeah, and that's our penultimate episode for season 1. I think it's covering episodes 7 and 8. Yeah, that's
Cool.
right. So we're almost done with season 1 already. Really
Awesome.
loving it. Yeah. Of course, if you cannot afford to support us on Patreon, we completely understand. Please continue sharing the podcast. This is very important. We're having a great time. We hope you are, and we hope you help us find new people to listen to the show. Of course, you can always leave a rating and a review. This week's Spotlight review comes from Kelly Judd over on Amazon. Wait, Amazon. Audible. Is Audible Amazon? It is, right?
I think so.
So I did not lie. It's Kelly J on Audible, who says, "This show is a solid follow-up to the stellar Kingslingers podcast, among other Doof podcasts, right out of the gate. Thank goodness they're promising nearly 100 planned episodes. Matt and Scott bring their comforting chemistry and energy to a deep dive into a subject they enjoy. I have a hard time sitting still long enough to watch movies, but the show makes me make the effort. Can't wait to watch the rest of Flanagan's work and read the books many are based on. Welcome back, ear friends." Aw, ear friends.
Thank you.
Thank you,
That's
Kelly.
so sweet.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who continues to send those reviews in. We see them. We appreciate them. Thank you very, very much. All right, Matt, we'll be back next week for more Gerald's Game. Hopefully, there will be a few less completely harrowing, terrible moments of mental torture. I have a feeling there's going to be some physical ones.
I feel like you might be right.
Yeah. But we will find out next week. We'll see you then.